Thank you to the Patreon members for supporting the channel. This video is sponsored by Chunky Code Monkey. Far, far downriver was a plateau. On that plateau was a spring, which fed a small stream, which trickled off the terrace in a gentle waterfall. And it was here, on this plateau, that the family of Iron Teeth decided to settle. There was bad water in the region, pouring out of underground sources and mixing with the river water below. But the terrace where the beavers were was protected, which is why they had picked it to be their new home. Here they would be safe from the bad water and able to build themselves a new settlement. The family was smaller than before. It had been a long journey. Some of the beavers had died, others had set off on their own, but the beaver Rozzy was committed to leading the family he had left. So the beavers got to work, chopping down trees for logs, gathering berries for food, and building water pumps along the stream. And the Iron Teeth wanted to get an early jump on science, something they struggled with last time. And their family was bigger than last time they had to start from scratch, which meant more workers and faster harvesting and construction. But it also meant more mouths to feed, so the beavers had to hurry to get their settlement up and running. And of course the beavers didn't have any beds or houses to sleep in, and probably wouldn't for a while. They had to tackle some more important projects first, but the Iron Teeth were just happy to have found such a perfect and safe location to call home. The Folktale family had settled on a new place to call home too. Unfortunately, it wasn't perfect or safe. You see, in the long journey to find a new home, the leader Venjo had passed away, and his grandson Vrisco had taken over. And Vrisco had decided that this islands region would be a good place to settle, which made everyone concerned about Vrisco's judgment. It is true that there was a lot of water in this area, but there was a lot of bad water in the mix as well. And there was a limited amount of dry land on which they could build and farm, which could be a problem because the Folktales family was still quite large, even after many beavers had died or left the clan on the journey here. But Vrisco was their leader now, and he had settled them here. Maybe he had a grand vision for the place and saw potential where everyone else saw only difficulty. Or maybe he was just young and foolish and didn't know what he was doing. It's hard to say, but it's not hard to see that this was going to be a challenge for the Folktales. But like the Iron Teeth, more beavers meant more workers, who would all need food and water to survive. And there wasn't but so much space to be able to make that happen, but still, getting a farm going was a top priority. The Folktales also wanted to harness science quickly, as advances in technology might be the only way these beavers survive. For once, having fewer beavers in the family was turning out to be a benefit for the Iron Teeth. They were pretty quickly eating through the supply of trees, but now that the inventor's hut was completed, the builders could focus on stream-powered industry. The first step was to build a water wheel and connect it to a lumber mill, which would provide them the planks they needed to build a forester's cabin, which would allow them to plant their own trees, which they'd need to build up and expand their settlement. The Iron Teeth had lots of things they needed to build, including the pods, which were the Iron Teeth's gross way of reproducing. Also storage, like for their berries. And the lumberjacks had already started on the second patch of trees. If they didn't start planting soon, production would totally stall. Look at those beavers go. Not a bad start for the Iron Teeth on the terrace. It would be nice if they had a place to sleep, but priorities. And though their tree supply was dwindling, a farmhouse was definitely a priority, because berries would only last them so long. They needed kohlrabis to feed their large and growing family. Kohlrabis grow quickly, which is good because the berry bushes were dry. Impressive progress for the Iron Teeth. Maybe less so for the Folktales. The beavers were moving fast, chopping down trees, planting carrots, pumping water. The Folktales were actually moving faster than the Iron Teeth. They had more beavers, but that was the problem. With so many beavers, the whole colony was doomed if they didn't get things up and running soon. They weren't racing the Iron Teeth, they were racing the clock. So they made a path over to the next island. This island had trees, something their island had run out of. The beavers waded across the water and got to work. They needed the logs, but there was an added benefit to harvesting on the adjacent island. More cleared land meant more room for more carrots, which would keep more beavers alive, assuming they could keep themselves hydrated, which was also a struggle. The family was so big they just couldn't get ahead of demand for anything. The beavers were getting hungry waiting for the carrots to grow. They were getting thirsty waiting for the water to pump. They were chopping trees, but they still didn't have a forester to replant. The Folktales were in a real delicate position here. Whereas the Iron Teeth were stable and kicking things into high gear. They now had storage for their logs and had built a second inventor's hut. Now they were just waiting for their kohlrabis to grow and enough science points to build a forester's cabin, so they could finally start their tree farm. The cabin went up quickly, and the forester got to work planting new pine trees. And since they would soon have a fresh supply of logs, the leader Rozzy decided it was time to build a barracks so they had a place to sleep. The Iron Teeth were hustling, and it was paying off. And the kohlrabis were ready to harvest, so they had a secure food supply as well. In addition to the pines the forester was planting, Rozzy wanted to get an early supply of oaks planted, since those took longer to grow but provided more logs per tree. The colony was expanding rapidly, and not just the buildings. The unholy abomination breeding pods were also producing. The Iron Teeth were absolutely thriving in their new home. But that wasn't true at all for the Folktales. Yes, they had started work on their first power wheel, so they could build a lumber mill so they could build a forester's cabin. And yes, somehow they were just barely keeping these thirsty beavers hydrated, but the hunger was setting in. You could feel the desperation rising. If the carrots didn't start sprouting soon, the Folktales would be done for before they even got started. I mean, that's a lot of hungry beavers. Starving beavers with nowhere to sleep but the carrot fields. It was good Venjo wasn't alive to see this sorry state. And to make matters worse, their rumbling tummies made the beavers work slower, which just compounded the problem. But despite slow progress, the lumber mill was ready, so they could start replanting trees soon. Not that it mattered if everyone starved to death first. Some carrots sure sounded good right about now. What spirit did they need to pray to about that? But luckily, the carrots started sprouting in the night, and the hungry beavers woke up the next morning with a sliver of hope to hold on to. The farmers were moving agonizingly slow, but these were intelligent beavers. They couldn't just start ripping crops out of the ground in a free-for-all. So slow and steady, the harvest began, and the carrots would get eaten up the moment the farmers dropped them off in the farmhouse. A second farmhouse helped with the harvesting, but they weren't out of trouble yet. The badwater was flowing, choking the land. But the Iron Teeth were safe atop their terrace. They even had a barracks to sleep in, and another one on the way, because a couple beavers were still sleeping on the ground. But better not, the Iron Teeth woke up and went to work with full stomachs, which is more than the Folktales could say. They also had a tree farm, which the Folktales didn't have either. Of course, they didn't know that. They hadn't even thought about the Folktales since the move. And truth be told, they liked the peace and quiet. It was nice to only worry about themselves for a change. The kohlrabi farm was doing great, the tree farm not so much. The beaver Zoljan was doing his best, but there were a lot of trees to plant, and since the beavers at the lumber mill had been hard at work, Rozzy had them build a second forester's cabin to finish the job. And trees weren't the only thing on Rozzy's mind. They were safe from the badwater, but before long a drought would surely come, and their little stream would go dry, unless they built a dam to hold the water back. The builders got to work, hoping they could finish the job before the season changed. They might have cut it too close. They were still struggling with rampant hunger, but the Folktales were trying to think ahead too. They needed to store water before the dry season, so they began work on what would be known as the row, taking advantage of the only deep water section in the area. So worst case, they could keep pumping when everything else went dry. They also finally got their forester's cabin, so they could use one island for crops and the other for trees. The farmers were farming and the water pumpers were pumping, but most of the beavers were still mega hungry. They couldn't even keep up with their basic needs now. What was going to happen when the drought kicked in? So Frisco had them plant even more carrots and build another farmhouse to help out. On the plus side, they had some sunflowers ready to harvest for a bit of variety. Not that variety mattered if everyone starved to death. It seemed like the beavers were finally stable on water, but the hunger was real, and if they couldn't get it sorted soon, they had no hope of surviving the coming dry season. The danger really hit home the next morning when they found the beaver Yamaki had died of starvation in the night. Poor Yamaki. Sadly, the Folktales couldn't even stop to mourn their friend and brother, and then later, the beaver war dog collapsed too, and passed away due to hunger. Was this the beginning of the end for the Folktales? Meanwhile, the Iron Teeth were feeling pretty great because they had finished the dam at the waterfall. So when the drought started and the land dried up, even though their stream had stopped too, the dam held back some water, keeping their land and plants green. At first, it seemed like the bad water would keep flowing during the dry season, suffocating the land with its toxic properties. But actually, the bad water sources had gone dry too. It just took longer for the sludge to clear out. So eventually, the riverbed was completely empty, but not before the bad water had done a number on the landscape. But the Iron Teeth settlement was safe and green, and even celebrating some new, births. With a bit of planning and engineering, the beavers had protected themselves from not only the drought, but the yucky bad water as well. And to top it all off, their tree farm was sprouting, ensuring their future success. the Folktales weren't feeling very successful. The drought was headed their way too, and the colony was still very hungry. The extra farms and farmers were still struggling to keep everyone fed, to the point they plotted another one on the island that was supposed to be just for trees. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and Vrisco was just trying to prevent anyone else from starving to death. And with more and more land going to farming, the Folktales wondered where they would even be able to build houses once they were able to. But that was way down the road. Right now, they had to focus on feeding everyone before the river and their crops dried out. Another reason a farm on the tree island made sense was its proximity to deep water, which should keep the crops growing when the other island inevitably dried out. But as the new fields of carrots began sprouting, a shift happened for the colony. Normally, a fresh crop meant the whole family descended on the farmhouses to gobble it up. But this time, the carrots actually started adding up as the farmers brought them in. For the first time, everyone was fed and the Folktales had a small surplus of food. And just before the dry season was supposed to start, they had some crops that should keep growing during the drought. But right now, the race was on to stock up as much as they could before the water was gone. And the next morning, the beavers watched as the waterfall in the distance dried up, and this wide and open river emptied, turning the green ground brown and infertile, including the land the Folktales had worked so hard for. And as expected, the crops dried up, except where they had planted near the deep water. And that bit of green gave them hope. The beavers had gathered a decent stockpile of carrots, but they weren't sure it would last. The family had just gotten used to eating again, so they decided to plant even more carrots near the deep water, this time on the riverbed itself. Would it work? Who knew? But it was worth a shot, and definitely better than waiting around. Although, waiting around for the drought to end was basically all the Iron Teeth had done, and it had worked out pretty well for them. Of course, they had a thriving family, a stable food supply, a booming tree farm, a dam, and a stockpile of food and water. All things the Folktales didn't have. The separation from the badwater below was like a metaphor. They had risen above the problems of the past, including the Folktales. And sure, sometimes life is a mixture of good and bad, but right now, the Iron Teeth were doing pretty darn good. The Folktales were doing, well, they didn't want to jinx it. Put it this way, if they could make it through the dry season, they'd be doing great. No one was immediately hungry or thirsty, so that was good. And they were taking advantage of the dry riverbed by chopping down some dead trees down there. And the deep water adjacent farm was sprouting, which was more good news. They still weren't sure if the riverbed carrots would sprout before the water returned, or even if they would need them. But given their recent history, more food sounded better than less. And finally, after the closest call they had ever had, the river waters returned for the Folktales too. Say what you will about beavers living on islands, but this view was magical. Of course, the bad water started flowing too, but soon it would all be one big swirling mess, just like life. Sometimes the bad parts sting a little bit, and then sometimes the good comes to wash it away. You don't need to be the perfect family living in the perfect place. You just have to work hard to take care of each other, even if you're still sleeping in the carrot fields. Hey everyone, Lieutenant Dan here. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Beaver Tales. There's more of this story to come, and many more stories on the channel, so I hope you stick around and check out the other fun stuff happening here at Lieutenant Dan Productions. Thanks again to the Patreon members, and thank you all for watching. You guys have a fantastic day.
I'm Chunky Coat Monkey, and I approve this episode.